Hello and welcome back to another episode of Vikings Happy Hour. We have a special guest here with us tonight, Dr. Eric Eager from Pro Football Focus, here to tell us if the Vikings can actually win the NFC North. So grab your Lake Monster beer and join us for what's bound to be an eventful show.
Welcome to Vikings Happy Hour, where we mix our favorite beverage and talk of your Minnesota Vikings. SKOL!
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Vikings Happy Hour. I am your host, Matt Anderson, and just like every other week, this show is sponsored by Lake Monster Brewing in St. Paul, Minnesota. Like I mentioned in the pre-show, we are joined tonight, a long-awaited, guest appearance by you, Eric. I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm finally glad that we could make it work. So, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a very eventful off season, and as we set off air, we're going to have a game tomorrow night. It's going to be fun, and we have a whole month of August to sweat out, make sure that no one gets injured, and we sort of get to the start of the season. But I'm very excited for all the stuff we're doing at PFF, and obviously really thrilled to join you guys tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I knew there was a game tomorrow night, but I didn't realize it was tomorrow night. And it's I forget who the Raiders are playing, but I'll be
the one Kyle Sloter of Minnesota Vikings preseason fame. I think will make a long awaited appearance as the Jacksonville Jaguars' second or third string quarterback tomorrow. So it should be fun.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to that. Myles, a permanent addition now to Vikings Happy Hour moving forward. Hello. Welcome.
What up?
How's the new house? How's the internet at the new house?
It's good. It's good. All of it's good. Eric, how much money do you have on tomorrow's game? That's what I want to know.
It's maybe a couple $100, but that's just it's long awaited, folks. Like, it's long awaited. I have probably a little bit more here on this New York Liberty game that's about to finish here against the Los Angeles Sparks, but we multitask here.
For sure.
I love to hear it. Dave, how are you on this Wednesday evening?
I am doing good. We are broadcasting live on the new beta version of eCam, and
Okay.
I'm looking for bugs because I'm one of their testers, and we have our first bug already with multiple. You guys see it in the comments windows. People normally broadcasting this won't, because I only put up one comment at a time. But everything's going good so far. So just like Vikings training camp, sort of.
Well, before we get into Vikings training camp, and thank you for the transition there, Dave, I think the main topic of tonight's show, in something that I want to talk to you and Myles specifically, Eric, is because I think you guys give a very realistic approach to, the arguments behind why you say things about the Vikings. So I'll just throw a blanket statement out there, and we can take it wherever we want to. But Eric, can the Vikings win the NFC North this season?
Yeah, sure they can. I think they're not the favorite by any stretch. I think they're if you, depending upon the marketplace, you're looking around 5-2 or something like that. So it's not they're not favorites. Green Bay is the favorites, and probably will be until Aaron Rodgers is gone. But Chicago's fading. I don't think that folks are going to see much out of the Chicago Bears this year. In fact, I think that you can make an argument that they're not even trying to win, the Chicago Bears. And then you look at Detroit. I've been big on Detroit this offseason because I think they have a lot of stuff going for them. They play hard for Dan Campbell. They have first-round picks kind of everywhere and in very important positions like both tackles, center, wide receiver, corner, defensive end. They have a lot of players and a lot of high drafted players there. They have a coach who, like I said, folks believe in, and they have a quarterback in Jared Goff who is not great. But you look at their schedule; they don't play any games after 1:00 Eastern this season. Only play one game that's not a Sunday game at 1:00 Eastern. So they have a decent schedule. So do the Vikings, and the Vikings, I think, are more talented at quarterback. Their high end talent, the Justin Jeffersons of the world, are as good as it gets. But just like every season, it's going to depend upon whether or not they can stay healthy. The last good season they really had, like truly elite season, they had all 11 starters start week 1 of 2017 and start the NFC Championship game. That is a far cry from what they've had the last few years and why they've struggled. So sure they can. I think that they're rightfully underdogs. I think they're basically a coin flip to make the playoffs. I think all of those market numbers are right. I'm not going to be betting against them this year, but I think expectations are maybe right down the middle for them. And as such, if Green Bay falters and you don't see the lead from Detroit, they could sit pretty in that division.
Do you think the Packers, though, are like overhyped at this point? Because I think losing Devontae Adams for that wide receiver core is a lot bigger than people are talking about. They think a guy like Watson or Alan Lazard can just step in and replace that role. So I guess for me, I'm kind of skeptical that the Packers are going to be as good as everyone thinks they will be.
Well, I think that you're seeing the Romeo Dubs is now what I think we all got it wrong, or Dobbs is emerging in camp. They get Tanyan back at tight end, a guy that they were going with Mercedes Lewis on a lot of the play action stuff last year, and you saw like in the tracking data that folks didn't really they didn't slow play the run game against the Packers because the Packers didn't really have the tight end to run a lot of good play action stuff with. Offensive line, they got Zach Tom from Wake Forest. Like they did do some reinforcements. You look at that defense, they get Quay Walker and Devontae Wyatt in the first round of the draft. They get Jair Alexander, probably one of the best corners in football, back. They get Adrian Amos is one of the best safeties, if not the best safety in football, in my opinion, going right now. Devondre Campbell had a great year last year. Kenny Clark, as Vikes fans know, is terrific. And I think Rashawn Gary is a great bet to win Defensive Player of the Year. So I think on that side of the ball, the Packers are formidable. To your point on offense, like there's a lot of projection that you have to make.
Myles, how about you? Do you share the same opinion as Eric as it pertains to the Vikings? Are you a little more pessimistic, optimistic?
I would give this team a slightly better opportunity than what we've seen the last couple of years from the Vikings. I'd probably put 9-10 wins as like the ceiling. I think they could be a playoff team though. I think there's an opportunity there. I think, as Eric's mentioned, the NFC is more wide open than it's ever been. The Packers, the Bears obviously tailing off. The Lions, who knows? The Packers, I still think the Packers are the best team in the NFC North until proven otherwise. I agree with you on the Devontae Adams thing, but obviously with Rodgers on offense, and they still have, even with Bakhtiari still hurt, and even with Elgin Jenkins hurt, they still do pretty well on the offensive line. And then they have, they still have like decent weapons. I don't know if Tanyan will be back, but they have Aaron Jones. They have, how am I drawing a blank on the running? A.J. Dillon. We'll see if the young receivers can do anything. I kind of heard Eric about this a couple weeks ago when we had went and grabbed dinner, but the Packers, unlike the Chiefs, we saw the Kansas City Chiefs, we saw the Packers, both teams trade their top end elite wide receivers for a lot of picks. The difference between the Chiefs and the Packers, though, is the Chiefs decided to replace Tyreek Hill's production with the draft and through free agency. They signed Marquez Valdes-Scantling, they signed Juju Smith-Schuster, they drafted Sky Moore, and then they obviously added more talent to their defense to go with Patrick Mahomes on offense with Mecole Hardman and Travis Kelce still there. So the Packers, on the other hand, just relied mainly on the draft, second round pick in Christian Watson, and then Romeo Dubs, I was kind of mentioned earlier, and then they signed Sammy Watkins for a cheap veteran deal, but and he's always a guy that's hit or miss and can't really stay healthy. But I'm curious to see how the Packers passing game does go because of that. You'd like to see them make it for the Packers' sake, not for the Vikings' sake. I like what they did, but from like a Packers side, I'm a little surprised they haven't decided to go out and add somebody, go see if they could trade for somebody. But looks like they're relying heavily on Aaron Rodgers, which if Aaron Rodgers continues to play the way he has last couple of years, he should help elevate those receivers. So I would say, and to go with an elite defense, so I'd still say that the Packers are probably the favorite, but the Vikings have a chance if the Packers offense can't really get things clicking.
And the Packers schedule, by the way, doesn't do them a ton of favors, right? So the Vikings schedule, they do have a road game in London, but that is a road game. So like that's more of a neutral site, which, plays to their strengths. The Packers go to US Bank Stadium in a situation where like, if I'm the Vikings, I'd rather get Green Bay at home week 1 before any injuries have happened, before they, So I think that the schedule shines more brightly on the Vikings than it does the Packers. You look at Green Bay right away, you go to Minnesota, which is a team you've lost to both the last 2 years. They go to Tampa Bay in week 3. They're the Patriots at home. And then you look at, sort of down the stretch, there, you have Rams, Dolphins could be pretty good, Vikings, Eagles, Cowboys, Titans, Bills, like kind of in that last 10 weeks of the year. Plus you get Detroit twice in the last like 12 weeks, which again is one of those where I think Detroit's going to be better at the end of the season than they are at the beginning. So, and there's also, I'm counting here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. They have like 5 or 6 games that are not noon Central, and so again, like they just have a little bit harder of a road there. But yeah, I mean, as one of the commenters said, Raymond said, I think you guys are too jaded. I think we're responding to evidence, which has been like what's happened the last bunch of years. But I do think that the thing sets up nicely for the Vikings. I'd actually disagree with Myles on like the ceiling. Like I think their ceiling is 11, 12 wins. I agree that their average is probably going to be around 9. I think in this case, like our simulation PFF makes it like 8.93 or something silly like that. If you can find like you can't on the market, but if you can find a flat 8.5, I would bet over 8.5 wins if it was like minus 110. At 9, you're probably losing money betting either side of that, just because the sportsbook is going to charge you a vig. So I think that we finally, after all these years, because bettors have really liked Minnesota because of Mike Zimmer, and he did really good against the spread. He did really well with kind of weaker quarterbacks in Bridgewater and Keenum and so on. They really liked the Vikings, and I think preseason expectations were always too high for them. I think finally, for the first time, sort of in the Cousins era, the preseason expectations for the Vikings are very reasonable. And I think that the market has finally caught up to who this team is, which is a team with flaws that can be really exposed, but also some high-end talent that if they string it all together, you could see months like you had in October of 2019, even with Cousins.
Yeah, well, and to your point, Eric, earlier, the Vikings played the Packers week 1, and I think that's a really good test for the Vikings early on, because I would assume the Packers won't have their offense really established yet. Obviously young receivers, they won't have that connection with Rodgers, I'd assume. So the Vikings might have a chance to win that one, not even just because, I think the Vikings might have a better chance to start fast than the Packers, but more so because the Packers offense might be reeling a little bit to start the season and need a little bit of time to gel.
On the flip side, though, the issue is like it could also be a bad thing for the Vikings in that like week 1, you're most likely to get Sammy Watkins healthy, right? That's a guy on that team.
The Lizard.
Romeo Doubs might not be found out yet. So like, a lot of these rookie receivers do better in the beginning of the year because, no one has any tape on them. So there's both sides of it. But I also think like if you're looking at Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter, you're probably getting either a weaker Bakhtiari than normal or no Bakhtiari, which should serve the Vikings in spades there. So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we might see the Packers try to run the ball a lot week 1 too.
One thing I was going to ask you guys quick, and I know this is one of the things when you hire an offensive coach, you don't lose that scheme year over year. But something that's not really talked about with the Packers is the fact that Nathaniel Hackett is gone, and Rodgers and him were really close from everything that we've heard. Do you think that plays a factor into at least what you guys are talking about week one in trying to figure out how that works in a real game simulation with a new offensive coordinator, where he had kind of like an experience with Nathaniel Hackett?
Did they bring
Yeah, I think
back?
all these things matter, right? I think new coaches can be good or bad. I think in the case where the new coach ends up going to be a head coach, you almost always have to say there's going to be some like negative regression, because there's a reason he's becoming a head coach, and that's because the results were great. So yeah, I think you do see a little bit of an issue there. It remains to be seen whether or not like that's actually going to have a positive effect on Denver. Not to change the subject, because Rodgers took a year under Hackett in 2019, where I know their record was pretty good, but his like efficiency stats and everything weren't great, and so he had to really buy in. Which, to your point, might mean that when he leaves, he's going to have to. It's going to take him more than just like one off season to buy into the next guy. I think LaFleur being the coach and the play caller like helps curb that issue significantly, but it's still with Rodgers is a weird dude, man. It's like, so you just never know what you're going to get. I think if you get but at the same time, he's won 200 MVPs the last 2 years, and the Vikings have beaten them twice. So I still think they match up well. I like I said, I think it's a great get for them to get the Packers week one at home. So it'll be a big test, as Myles said. I think if they come out and they win that game, people are going to change their opinion of the Vikings very quickly. If they come out and lose that game, then you look at this schedule that they have, and you go to Philadelphia, and I think that game is going to be really tough for the Vikings, because Philadelphia is really good at the line of scrimmage and the Vikings aren't. But and then you get Detroit, who's a team that they're only going to be about 5-point favorites in that game. So it like I said, like Myles said, that's a huge game in week one against the Packers.
And Matt, to that point, to kind of what Eric was saying about the Packers, the Vikings also have a brand new coaching staff too. So the Packers have a change at OC, but their head coach is the same, and he's the one calling the plays. So you probably shouldn't see too much of a disconnect between what they're doing. I would assume that Rodgers and LaFleur are still building off of what they've been doing. Just obviously not Nathaniel Hackett as a traditional OC. It's just someone new. But the Vikings obviously have a whole new scheme and coaching staff. So, but I will say the difference between Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers that shades Kirk is Kirk has more flexibility, and whoever his OC is, he's still going to be Kirk Cousins. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers at his elite level is Aaron Rodgers, but Kirk doesn't get in his head the way that Aaron does when it comes to those types of relationships, because Kirk's very much the business first. So I'll give him an edge on that, in that you probably won't see too much of a difference in how Kirk plays, but you might see a slight difference with Rodgers, just because he is that type to get in his head about things.
Here's a question that I have, though, because I agree with you. I think that Kirk's been like sixth in the NFL in wins above replacement since he joined the Vikings. A lot of that has to do with the fact that he started almost every game and, WAR as an accumulation stat, but it's still a very impressive feat for him. I think that the issue is, at this point in time, and it's not Kirk's fault, the sort of order and that all this has happened in, but I think other than, I think he's in the top, half a dozen quarterbacks in the NFL in terms of age this year. Are we, and again, I'm always the person who's looking to make a case, necessarily against, I'm not, look, I don't have any bets on the Vikings this year other than I have Kevin O'Connell to win Coach of the Year. I think that's a great bet. I also don't have that many bets against the Vikings, just because, again, I think that they could be really good. But you always have to look at reasons why this could go bad, this could go poorly. And, so Tom Brady turns 45 today. Ben Roethlisberger retired, so he would have been 40. Aaron Rodgers turns 39 this year. Matt Ryan turns 37. Stafford, Cousins, Tannehill, Wilson are all 33, right? All 33 years old. Joe Flacco is only 36. We think of him as being old, but that thing sort of fell off the table, in the early 30s. is that the leak here? And because, when we look at the history of the Vikings with Cousins, it never has been one thing. It's always been like, early on, he never got along with DiFilippo and the offense was kind of ass. And then, that didn't work. And then 2019, it was, they actually played pretty well, but the schedule was kind of weak. So they weren't prepared to beat the 49ers in the playoffs. And then the last 2 years, it was always like the defense, because of the investment they had to make in the quarterback and to support him and everything. The defense is really brittle. They got injured. And then, even though Kirk played very well, the team couldn't win. Now, and coaching, I think, got worse down the stretch, obviously with Zimmer and so on. Now you come in and theoretically, I think Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, very smart guy, had a very, I think, deliberate plan this year. Kevin O'Connell, could be very good. We don't know. It's another new play caller for Cousins. Some of these things, and then the defense, I think that they've done a better job. Like drafting a guy like Andrew Booth was a very good move. Harrison Phillips is a good addition and things like that. But is the next leak the fact that Kirk Cousins' best years are behind him as far as age is concerned? Because I think everybody believes the thing is just going to be linear. But I mean, you're talking about a 34-year-old quarterback who, to your point, Myles, I mean, I think he's a very good businessman and he's a very good quarterback, but he's not Tom Brady obsessed with the game of football. So when this thing falls off, it might just be one of those where he's like, okay, I'm moving on to something else.
I will say,
just
because Matt, I'll let you go ahead.
It was just a quick curiosity question. Have there been quarterbacks that have started to peak around this time?
It's very hard. I mean, I have to look back,
Alex Smith and KC.
Yeah, I mean, with Alex Smith,
Matt Ryan, maybe.
I mean, but Matt Ryan started falling off. I mean, you look at
That's what I mean.
Smith.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, Alex Smith broke his leg. I mean, Alex Smith's really bad broken leg was his age 34 season. He led the league in passer rating at age 33. So even him, kind of as we think of Alex Smith as a late bloomer, I mean, he really topped off at age 33. You look at Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan won MVP at age 31. His last few years, I think he's been a good quarterback, but not like his, let's look at just passer ratings, not the best statistic, but we all know the scale. Like his year 33 season, he had a 108.1 passer rating. His year 34 season, he had a 92.1. So he dropped 16 points, and he's basically been around that low 90s passer rating league average or so the last 3 years. Again, I'm not here to say I think Cousins is going to fall off the cliff. I think a lot of people are saying, okay, you have all these things where O'Connell's going to come in, he's going to be great. And I think that that's a reasonable gamble. The offensive line is better, and they've done more to try to put players on the interior, although it looks like Garrett Bradbury is being thrown around like a rag doll again. But the offensive line has more to it than it has, I think, in the past. And the two tackles, I think, are going to be very good for this team. Wide receiver, you have the best player in football other than the quarterbacks, in my opinion, in Jefferson at wide receiver. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, and Cousins has gotten better the last few years, which is actually absolutely true. And then they're saying, okay, and then this is very the whole thing of everything that's great is going to stay great, and all the things that were shitty we're gonna fix, and then inevitably some of the things that were great they fall back down to earth. That's the concern that you have to have if you're a bull on the Vikings this year.
So you bring me to one of my topics, I guess, for tonight, and that is your biggest concern for the Vikings this upcoming season. I think a lot of people will point to depth behind Irv Smith, and we've already kind of seen that transpire here in training camp. Cornerback depth as well. I mean, maybe not depth is the right word, but just trying to figure out which one of those guys is going to step up. If it's Dantzler, if it's Booth, if it's Chandon Sullivan, who's brought over from the Packers. Is it the O-line again? So, Myles, I'll let you take this one first, but what is your biggest concern kind of heading into this season? Because I do feel like fans are optimistic, and it's valid. They should be. But I think we need to look at this through a different lens.
I mean, I think it's kind of a combination of everything. The Vikings are, again, like they have been the last couple of years, they're a top heavy roster. I think Kwesi did his best to add depth and some added depth and talent and youth to the rosters to help backfill and provide future opportunities for guys the best he could. I mean, he wasn't really given that much. Rick had kind of tried to go all in, pseudo go all in the last couple of years, so his Kwesi came into a tough situation cap wise and roster wise, but I think he did a good enough job at least to keep them competitive this year, which is clear that that's what the Wolves and ownership wanted to do. But yeah, I think you combination of top heavy roster, lack of overall depth, and then new coaching staff. I mean, as I want to give Kevin O'Connell all the benefits of the doubt, and I think long term he's going to be a good coach, and hopefully we see it year one. But there's going to be growing pains offensively and defensively, and yes, we're going to see a lot of really good things from this team. But I also think we got to also understand that there are going to be things that we saw previously from from the last couple of years for the Vikings that they're gonna sneak back up this year too, because it's overall like the same team. They're switching some things up, and hopefully situationally they can be better. But overall, it's a very similar team. So I'm not gonna act shocked if we see some similar results, this year as we did the last couple of years. Not even because I don't think O'Connell's a good fit, but I think just because of the overall roster and what they are. I mean, unless you can truly improve some of those situational outcomes, like at end of halves, end of games, those types of things. Obviously, I think the defense is going to improve in some of those areas. Do I think it's going to be drastic? Probably not. And that's where I think, for me, I think that's why I say like 9-10 wins is where I think this team could be, just because I think they have talent, but they need people to stay healthy, and they need Kevin O'Connell to be, and I should say Ed Donatel as well. They need those guys to be above average at what they do.
Yeah, I think. I mean, you bring up a good point. I actually think like this year, the secondary isn't going to be great, but they at least have numbers to throw at the problem in a way that they didn't last year, the last few years, right?
More youth,
you have three
more depth.
corners,
Yep.
more youth. I mean, look, Cam Bynum, if he ends up being a good player, like then they're in a really good spot because they have three safeties, and they can be creative there. Because I'm going to get to my biggest issue, which is I think they have very little depth in the front seven. And
on both sides.
I actually went back and looked at the numbers because my hypothesis was that Danielle Hunter, who I think a lot of Vikings fans believe is on par in the history of the franchise with guys like Chris Dolman and Jared Allen and the really truly great pass rushers of the last 50 years or so of Vikings history. But up until recently, Danielle Hunter was very much a different football player when Everson Griffin wasn't on the field. When you looked at Everson Griffin, the on-off splits with Hunter was far more effective when Griffin was on the field with him. And so, I think and this is just a little bit of a praise for Everson Griffin. I think Everson Griffin was the superstar on that defense. And I think Danielle Hunter, if you look at and I've done some of this research, you could look at the MIT Sloan stuff where I've looked at get off rates and stuff like that. And Danielle Hunter is very much he gets off the ball not necessarily as fast as some of the elite pass rushers. He does a great job of cleaning up stuff, but you need another defensive end on the field to push the quarterback into you to get those kind of sacks. So all this is to say is the Vikings right now have two edge players who I think are good number two edge players, like elite number two edge players in Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter. Then they have a bunch of guys, and I know DJ Wanham had 8 sacks last year, but you look at the pressure rates, and it was basically a very hollow 8 sacks. If either one of those guys get hurt, I think they're screwed as a defense as far as being able to rush the passer. That's a really big issue for me. Against the run, Tomlinson and Phillips should be okay. But the linebacker position was also one where Eric Kendricks was really bad last year. I mean, he got washed up a lot in the run game. He was okay in coverage, but he got eliminated a lot. I think moving to a 3-4 defense, on base downs, because you only play the sort of base like a quarter to a third of the time, will help because he doesn't have to, sort of cover as much ground and stuff. But you're looking at a guy like Jordan Hicks, who, he's been up and down in his career. He had very good years in Philly. Like 16 was a really good year for him. Last year was a pretty good year. But he's also played so poorly at times during his career that the team like the Arizona Cardinals drafted his replacement 2 years in a row, right? And then, all this is to say, even if Kendricks and Hicks do well, if either one gets hurt, then who's playing that second position for him? They've always sort of had struggles there with the guys like Troy Dye and Surratt and guys like that. So yeah, I think the secondary is going to be better this year. To me, if the front seven has to be effective and it has to stay healthy, and there are a couple of things going against that, namely, the injury, the age of guys like Kendricks, the injury history of guys like Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter. That's my main concern, is whether they can do that.
Do you feel like they upgraded though? Like, so obviously Anthony Barr is gone, and Michael Pierce is gone, and in comes Harrison Phillips and Jordan Hicks. Do you feel like they upgraded at those spots?
Michael Pierce was pretty damn good last year. So I don't, Phillips is a nice football player, so I'm not going to say that they downgraded, but Pierce was a pretty good football player when he played last year. Anthony Barr didn't play a lot, but I think we're going to look back at Anthony Barr's career, and I think we at PFF are maybe culprits here, where his PFF grade oscillated a lot because linebacker play is super dependent upon whether or not you're healthy and whether teams target you and stuff. And I think Anthony Barr was a far better linebacker than people gave him credit for, and he was so versatile in ways that, like, I think it took us a while to see as Vikings fans and observers. I think he's going to be a lot to replace. Now, I think this new scheme is going to require less of Jordan Hicks than Mike Zimmer required of Anthony Barr. So in that way, they might be able to upgrade. But then if they require less of the inside linebacker, that means they're going to require more of the interior guys. And I mean, you're talking about, their first interior defensive lineman off the bench is Armand Watts, who, like, we're still unsure if that's an NFL player. So that's kind of where I get a little bit worried. I do think they at least were laterally moving in some places, but upgrade maybe would be a little bit too far for me.
Okay, I think that's fair. I mean, I think what some of the concerns that I have, at least, and this will kind of bring me to one of the rookies I want to talk about, but is just and you brought it up too, but the age of some of these defensive players. I mean, when you talk about Patrick Peterson, you talk about Harrison Smith, you talk about Eric Kendricks, like, these guys are getting up there, and we kind of talked about it with Kirk too, how it's not just going to be a linear progression of their career. Like, they are bound to fall off eventually. And so, I think when we sit here and we look, especially on the Vikings defensive side of the ball, I'm really concerned with those key vets they're counting on, in being sure, can they even hold up in a season? What were you going to say, Myles?
Well, I was just going to touch on that. I think the one thing I'm impressed by Kwesi this offseason is he focused on trying to add some of that future depth and guys that he knew weren't going to be able to play right away, but guys that they hope they can develop and hopefully take over some of those, whether it's continued depth or even taking over some of the starters roles. Like, obviously with Booth, Andrew Booth, obviously there's been good reviews to start camp. Hopefully that continues to progress into the season and into the future, so that, you have him, and hopefully Dantzler can be the two outside guys. Caleb Evans too. He was a 4th round pick that they spent a future 4th to make sure they got him too. So, you're hoping that those guys in the secondary can be long term. Your guys long term, and then obviously with Scene, and then you got Bynum. Hopefully those guys can be the replacements for Harrison Smith down the road. So they did. I thought Kwesi did a good job on the defensive end, at least trying to address some of those positions that Rick didn't always do because Rick was so focused on the now. And so I think that's part of the competitive rebuild that Kwesi talked about, is adding some of those guys. Even, I'm not saying I like the pick or even the person, but the Ed Ingram pick, I thought that was too early. But they brought in a Chris Reed, they brought in a Jesse Davis, but they still said we need to improve the interior of the offensive line. So they drafted Ed Ingram. Again, I don't like the pick, especially that early, but I understand what they're trying to do in terms of getting guys now and for the future, especially since they are such a top heavy roster. They need young guys to step in and take over some of these positions that expensive guys have. And so you hope like a Patrick Peterson, you hope Andrew Booth and Dancer can be those guys long term. You hope Ed Ingram and Ezra Cleveland can be your guards long term. Those types of things that I was impressed that Kwesi did this offseason.
And we've talked about that before too, Miles. At least with the past regime and their inability to almost look ahead. They always kind of drafted for the now because they were literally always putting their chips in the middle to try and win
Right.
now.
Well, once they signed Kirk, they kind of put themselves in that position. And I think a new regime kind of got a little bit of that. The new regime obviously had to re-up with a lot of the older vets and bring a lot of those guys back, but they also got a little bit more leeway and time to start developing guys and bringing guys in and along slower than what the older regime did too. So I think there's a little bit of that like positive regression I think that we've talked about that we should see from some of these older guys, but hopefully again some of these younger guys that they brought in can be the future.
Yeah, for sure. You both have mentioned Andrew Booth on more than one occasion tonight, and so I just want to touch on him quick. He's getting some rave reviews out of training camp here. People are saying that he's super aggressive, he's confident, and his play is sort of backing that up. Now, I know it's training camp. I know the pads just recently went on, but Eric, I'll turn it to you first. What is like a reasonable expectation for a guy like Andrew Booth or even Lewis Seen for that matter? I know he's still kind of playing with the twos, but what could be deemed as a success for Andrew Booth or Lewis Seen this upcoming year?
I mean, for Booth, you really just want to see him healthy. I mean, he didn't even play 1,000 snaps at Clemson in 3 years. He topped out last year at 578. He was very productive, though. I mean, there were a bunch of games where he barely gave up anything in coverage. In fact, he had 4 games where he gave up 1 yard or less in coverage, which is just fantastic play. But he has to stay healthy. I mean, like he's missed practice before, already. He's missed OTAs at times, from what I can tell with the reports. You just got to stay healthy because, like, that's the biggest thing, right? Like, if you have a corner, like the Bengals showed this, if you have a cornerback room full of like 3 or 4 guys who all stay on the field and they're all average, you can be pretty damn good, And if you have, and the Vikings have shown this, if you have a corner who's amazing sometimes and terrible other times, it's hard to win that way. And terrible, I mean, like injury-wise. Like, you look at Xavier Rhodes, was like one of the best players in football for a large stretch of his career. And then there were other times where either ineffectiveness at the beginning of his career or injury at the end, like he couldn't play. And so I think with Booth, you really need a guy, you need him to stay healthy, right? Like his first, like if he started 17 NFL games, he would play more snaps in that season than he played at Clemson total. So that is a huge projection, right? And that I think is why, this year expectations should be relatively modest. I know, when you look at the Rams, I was somebody who was, relatively skeptical of the Rams, sort of stars and scrubs approach. But one big ingredient to that was their ability to stay healthy. One of their analysts, Sarah Bailey's really, that's what basically she focuses on is all like the player physical data and, how many steps they're taking in a day and like how much, stress and strain they put on their body. And, that team, they had some injuries, but you look at that team over the past 5 or 6 years, they've really had an edge over the NFL in terms of staying healthy. Can Kevin O'Connell bring some of those principles over here so the guys like Andrew Booth can, be better than, if they went to an average NFL team with an average sort of approach to keeping players healthy, it might not be as good. Like, I think that's the gamble the Vikings are making here. With Seen, I think Seen's got to win the starting spot. You don't get picked in the first round and then get beat out by a second-year player who is a mid-round pick. If he can win that starting spot, then I think, and play all 17 games and start all 17 games, and, safety play is really hard to, like, discern, especially when he's going to be more of that, the Anthony Harris to the Harrison Smith. But if he can just play every game, I think that's probably good expectations for this year.
Miles, same boat there for you?
Yeah, I think the first 4 picks the Vikings had, they should all have some sort of contribution this year. At least that's the hope. Like Eric said, I think Seen should win that job. But I do think we should see all three safeties play quite a bit this season, which isn't a bad thing. That should help the defense significantly. And then I think we touched on Andrew Booth. Again, if he can stay healthy, I think that's huge for this defense, because they don't have Cam Dantzler, because obviously with the Jeff Gladney situation before, obviously the tragic death, but like obviously that situation, you're hoping he would take a step, and then obviously his off the field stuff happened, and the Vikings never really addressed the cornerback position last offseason once they released Jeff Gladney. And so they obviously, I know they brought in, how am I drawing a blank?
Yeah, they brought in Peterson and Breland, but those are not real long-term.
Right. They're not exactly. They're not long-term plays. They're not guys that you're like, they're like, obviously Patrick Peterson's back, but that's because of necessity. That's because they didn't address anything last offseason. And so, you hope with Booth that he can play a solid role and just be decent and show obvious flashes and things. And then Ed Ingram, I touched on before. You kind of hope he can win that right guard job. If not right out of camp, then at least a few games down the road, because Jesse Davis isn't a world beater. He's nothing special. So if you draft a guy in the second round in an interior offensive line, you expect that guy to be good early. So and then a Caleb Evans, again, early, like I said earlier, that's more depth. That's the guy that should be your two deep at some point, because the Vikings don't really have anybody else. They have Chris Boyd, they have and then Shannon Sullivan's the nickel, so he's kind of his own island, but they don't really have any other true depth players. They brought in Perry Nickerson, Nate Hairston, but like Harrison Hand, none of those guys are anything to write home about. So Caleb Evans has a lot of opportunity to solidify that role as like the fourth cornerback on this team.
He's definitely a fan favorite.
Yeah.
I know a lot of fans are really high on him. Well, I think that's fair. So while I have Eric on, I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk more about Kirk Cousins. I know that he kind of has, well, he lives in people's heads on Twitter when it comes to Kirk Cousins and the realistic takes he kind of has. But I want to pose a question to you here, Eric, and it's it's can Kirk Cousins change the narrative of what his whole career has been this season? I know it's training camp and we're getting a lot of buzzwords around here, but we've seen some improvisation at training camp. He's had some nice throws. Dalvin Cook's been on record saying that he's seen a change in Kirk since Kevin O'Connell's come around. Everyone's buying in. So what can Kirk do this season to change the narrative?
Well, I mean, for Vikings fans, he's probably got to take this team to an NFC Championship game or a Super Bowl for the first signing to make any sense, right? Like, 4 years in, you have one playoff appearance, you have 0 division titles, all these things, and I know that winning has a lot more to do with the quarterback than just the quarterback. But quarterback is the most influential aspect of winning games in football, so he bears a decent amount of responsibility for that. The quarterback contract comes with all the second order effects, et cetera, et cetera. So these things have been litigated. These things have been litigated over and over and over again. And ultimately, people who were bearish on the Vikings signing Kirk in the first place and then extending him in the second place have been proven right. Be that as it may, you can still win with him at quarterback. Like, I think that the hardest part is for a guy like Cousins, he's going to probably – his highest chance of having success is very clearly being put on a Super Bowl caliber team, a la what happened in 2018, but also what happened to Matthew Stafford. I think Stafford's a very comparable quarterback to Cousins, and Stafford won a Super Bowl. Now, the Lions could never build a Super Bowl team around him. Like, they could put him on a Super Bowl team and win. I have a similar view of Cousins. I think Cousins could win a Super Bowl. Like, let's say they would have traded him to Tampa Bay this year or something like that. Like, he could have won a Super Bowl. I think it's hard to build around him the way that they're trying to. So but he can silence doubters by taking this team deep into the playoffs. And in an NFC where, I mean, you look at it, we talk about Green Bay, they have their flaws, but I think they're elite. LA has their flaws, but I think that they're elite. Tampa Bay, who's facing some injuries, Dallas, like those four teams are clearly better than the Vikings. From there, San Francisco, Philly, I think are better than the Vikings, but not by that much. And then you're talking about the Vikings are next up, right? Like the Vikings are basically, team number, you have New Orleans, you have Arizona, you have, that's kind of it, right? With Minnesota right there. So they can make it. And if they make it, they're not going to be in a situation where, I remember as a Chiefs fan, like, every single game that the Chiefs went into the playoffs with Alex Smith, they had the worst quarterback. So no shit, they lost all their playoff games because it's Alex Smith versus Tom Brady. It's Alex Smith versus Big Ben. The one time Alex Smith won a playoff game for the Chiefs, they were facing Brian Hoyer. Like sometimes it's not that hard, to sort of handicap these things. So if they get in the playoffs and it's, Kirk Cousins off a really good season against Dak Prescott, they might not be favored, but I like their chances. If it's Kirk Cousins against Kyler Murray, they might not be favored, but I like their chances. If it's Kirk Cousins versus Trey Lance, they might not be favored, but I like their chances. So they have a chance there. Now, can he fundamentally change who he is? My bet is on no. Like, we talk about this with all kinds of things. You can explain away any one thing about Cousins. You can explain away the Justin Jefferson wanted me to come work out and I had family stuff. You can explain that away. It's a very reasonable excuse. You can explain away the fact that Mike Zimmer hated his guts from the moment that he met him, and it never got better. And, Kirk rarely made an effort until the last year when, that he finally wanted to meet face-to-face with the guy once a week. You can explain that away. You can explain away every single micro thing about the quarterback, but the collection of these things is okay. I got to address this comment by Kyle Bland. You say this that we have to stop collectively talking about quarterback versus quarterback. I would suggest that if you look at you look at the winningest quarterbacks in NFL history are all the best quarterbacks. Like let's stop pretending that this game is more complicated than that. It is more complicated than that, but ultimately it's who you face. The quarterback position, it drives everything. It's why Manning. I mean, you look at the quarterbacks that have won Super Bowls. It's either quarterbacks on a rookie deal, which we'll talk about, or it's the very, very elite type of players. It's Brady, it's Mahomes, it's Manning, it's all those players. So it is almost entirely about the quarterback. Everything else is a rounding error at that point. But to the point about Cousins, can he change fundamentally? No, I don't think so. I think he is who he is. Myles described him as a businessman. I think he's a first ballot Hall of Fame businessman. Is he good enough to win a Super Bowl when you catch all the breaks? I think so. The question then becomes is how likely are they to catch all the breaks? And I think this year, the way that everything is lined up for them, schedule-wise, NFC-wise, their chances of catching all the breaks are slightly higher than most years.
So you're telling me that the Vikings could make a deep playoff run? Myles is already rolling his eyes.
Well, my thing is Kirk's been a starting quarterback 8-9 years now, and his teams have gone to the playoffs twice in that time period, and that's fine. I'm not that is what it is. But at what point do we stop? At this point, it should be NFC Championship, Super Bowl, or what are we doing? I'm sick of having to give excuse after excuse after excuse for not just Kirk, but the teams that Kirk are leading. That's all. That's my biggest issue is there's always some minor excuse. The right guard was the issue. The offensive coordinator was the problem. But the head coach became the problem. I'm just sick of all the excuses at this point. Just win. That's all we care about. That's all we want to see. I'm not gonna nitpick Kirk Cousins if he's throwing 220 yards, 2 touchdowns and an interception if the team's fucking winning. I couldn't care less about his stats. I know people love the fucking stats, but like I don't care about the stats. I want wins. I want the
Well,
stats to lead to wins, but they're not leading to wins. So stop. Yeah.
Yeah, and the quarterback, who you choose to be your quarterback, is part of everything. So Kyle's over here. He says they also had better surroundings. The Rams had the number one D. They did not have the number one defense last year. By the way, they were top 10. They were number one the previous year. And funny, because their quarterback wasn't quite as good, they bowed out in the second round of the playoffs. Funny how that happens. But also, and again, this is part of the whole process of you can mortgage the future and put a guy like Stafford on an already good team and win, right? But if you want to if you want to build around a quarterback, he's probably got to be better than Cousins. He's probably got to be better than Stafford. He's probably got to be better than Derek Carr. He's probably got to be better than Ryan Tannehill. If you put Tannehill on an already good Titans team, then he can take them to the AFC Championship game. But funny, that team has gotten worse basically every year since then because they had to pay Tannehill all the money. And this gets back to the whole thing about the support. The support is part of the quarterback. When you pay the quarterback all that money, right, you have to make decisions that are that are compromised by the quarterback's contract. Now, you can push money around, and there are some pockets, there are some years where his cap hit isn't quite as much. There are some years where his cap hit's more, but the contract is big. We're not going to sit here and say that that hasn't influenced things. Instead of being able to sign a real center, they had to draft one in Garrett Bradbury, and that's just a lower chance of success, right? The Vikings have still never signed a market level offensive free agent since Cousins was the quarterback, right? And I'm not talking about Tajay Sharp or Chris Reed or bullshit like that. I'm saying they have not signed they have not signed a Joe Tooney. They have not signed a Mitchell Schwartz. They have not signed a third wide receiver to go with this team. They have not signed an outside free agent to a market level deal since Kirk Cousins became the quarterback. And that is, and the most expensive contract they've given out to an outside free agent, period, were 2 nose tackles. Tomlinson at 2 years, $22 million, and Michael Pierce at 3 years, $27 million. You can kind of use the Darius Smith deal. It's kind of a little bit, but it's effectively a 1-year deal. When you have a quarterback like Cousins, the lack of support is part of the equation. You cannot divorce him. And again, we're not blaming him. We're saying his contract yields a reality that you have to live in. And if he can't overcome that reality, that is partially his fault because of how he's paid. Every single Super Bowl except for one since 2012 has involved a quarterback who is on a rookie contract. And when a quarterback is on a rookie contract, you can build around, right? Joe Burrow, right? When he's making $10 million a year, you can buy an entire secondary in one offseason like the Bengals did. That's how it goes. And when your offensive line is ass for a year, you can buy a whole offensive line the next year, right? Instead, when you have a quarterback like Cousins and your center sucks, you have to draft a center at 18, which is an overdraft, and you have to hope that he performs. And those are bad gambles.
And you know what?
Yes, but Kyle, they extended those players older when they like Thielen should never have gotten an additional extension. Everson Griffin got an extension.
How does that make them better? That's just all those extensions did was move money around so that they could be cap compliant. It didn't make them better.
Kyle Rudolph got a contract extension the year they drafted Irv Smith. All these things, they didn't need to do those things. That's just them trying to run back the same core of players as us. That core continued to get older, and that core has now gotten older, which is why Anthony Barr is no longer on this team, which is why Everson Griffin is no longer on this team. They got rid of how am I missing the nose tackle? Linval Joseph. Those guys are gone because they become dead weight after a certain point because they have to. You have to start cutting aging expensive veterans because you extended those aging expensive veterans. But then you get
it's not over, by the way, because Kwesi gets off season.
Anthony Barr cost $10 million to the Vikings cap this year, also that they could save $2.9 million last year. All those types of things that Everson was doing.
Those extensions were not good things. They were extensions to move money into future years so they could be cap compliant because of the the issues that they had. They had to be cap compliant just to fill a roster out with real NFL players. And yes, that's the point, Kyle. But so here's I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a secret. One day, Adam Thielen's gonna suck, and the fact that the Vikings had to extend him, into future years to the point where if you look at Adam Thielen, like that dude is going to be on the team. That dude is. I mean, he has a $13 million dead cap charge if they cut him next year. That means if he falls off a cliff, he's still going to be on this roster. And then you're going to come back and be like, oh, Adam Thielen declined. Yes, and you chose out of your own free will to extend the quarterback and to push the money back on Thielen so that you could sign a guy like Zadarius Smith. And again, those are all connected. These things are not independent. And again, we're not blaming Kirk personally, but the contract is the reason why the roster doesn't have that much flexibility. And to Kwesi's credit, when the ownership and him decided to at least like compete, I think that he put some of the things in place that at least give them a chance to compete this year, bleed out a little bit next year, and then eventually move on at, possibly at the quarterback position. But all of these things are connected to each other. You cannot absolve Kirk Cousins. Like when Kirk went on the team, they were elite. 2018, he was plopped onto an elite team. And while that talent was prime and ready for a Super Bowl, he did not perform. And then as he got better, and we've all said this, he's gotten better, the rest of the roster atrophied because that's what players do when they get older. And the problem is he missed the window. And now that he's pretty damn good, the rest of the roster sucks. And that's why Zimmer and Spielman are fired.
The the high-end contracts made the draft that much more important to hit early. You had to hit. The Vikings had to hit on I'm not saying he was a hit, but they had to hit on a Garrett Bradbury from day one. They had to hit on Brian O'Neill. They had to hit on Mike Hughes. They had to hit on these early draft picks, which they ended up not hitting on, but because they had to. Good teams don't have to hit on early round draft picks to be successful. The Vikings put themselves into situations where they needed those rookies to be successful for them to be successful. That in itself is a problem.
The draft cannot be a place where you're trying to fill needs. And when your roster, when you are like, look, the draft is where you find value. The draft is where you find edge players. The draft is where you find wide receivers. The draft is where you find corners, and the draft is where you find, tackles. Like, and the Vikings, look, you can talk about the poor draft record. Darrishaw's a pretty damn good tackle. O'Neill's a pretty damn good tackle. Jefferson's a pretty damn good wide receiver, and Dantzler has a chance to be a pretty good corner. You act like you're that he was supposed to hit on every single freaking pick. They've hit on picks. The problem is they don't have the money to supplement a roster that has holes, right? When Kansas City blew a Super Bowl because they had no linemen, they were able to go out and get Joe Thuney, right, to supplement that. They were able to go trade for Orlando Brown, and they were able to let Jesus take the wheel on the other three offensive line positions because their quarterback's freaking good and can overcome it. He doesn't need a perfect offensive line to be a good quarterback, right? I mean, you look at this. So I talk about Kansas City. Kansas City's 2018 draft. Let's look at this for a second. We have Breeland Speaks, Derek Nottie, Dorian O'Daniel, Armani Watts, Tremont Smith, Khalil McKenzie. 2 of those players are still in the league, and none start. And the Chiefs won the Super Bowl the next year. It's about who the quarterback is. And it's about the quarterback contract and whether he can overcome it. That is how this thing works. We want to get further into – Brett Veach had a great draft this year. The next year, McCole Hardman, an okay player. Juan Thornhill, an okay player. Like Kylan Saunders, Rashawn Fenton, Darwin Thompson, Nick Allegretti. They win a Super Bowl that year despite basically drafting 1.5 starters in 2 drafts. 1.5 starters in 2 drafts. They hosted 2 FC title games, won a Super Bowl.
That's exactly it, though. Like the ownership got talked into the idea that it was only Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer's fault, point blank, period. And so they said, We want to see what things are like without those guys. Bring in the young offensive head coach, and see how he does with Kirk Cousins. See how he does with Justin Jefferson. See how he does revamping this roster and with Kwesi. And I'm not even like upset with the fact that they decided to run it back. It's that they had to continue to push older veteran money down the road to make it happen, even to make the roster they currently have happen. And like, I know people think that they have $10 million of cap space right now. That's not effective cap space. That money is not something that they can just go out and spend another $5, $6, $7 million to go add to the roster. That money is for roster bonuses. That money is for IR. That money is for practice squad. That money is to get you through the rest of the season. That money isn't like money that you can use to go add depth like a center. The Vikings wanted to try to go sign a J.C. Treader or I don't even know who's out there, but like, they don't have the money to do that. And so, because Garrett Bradbury isn't any good, so the tough part there is like, you kind of want to run it back. You want to see if this team can be good, but all they're doing is they're buying time. But I don't really know what they're buying time for, other than just to see if the young guys can progress, and then hopefully they can revamp that entire roster around some of their core players like a Jefferson, and then obviously some of the young guys that they've recently drafted.
Kyle, my brother in Christ, Buffalo is not going to be in the same boat. Josh Allen is like twice the quarterback that Kirk is. Like, we got to stop this kind of stuff.
And just talk about the contracts real quick, Eric. Like, Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, and they're unprecedented. They signed long-term deals. Those long-term deals mean that you can create flexibility and plan for longer around the cap. The Vikings with Kirk Cousins on 2, 3, 1-year extensions, they don't get to plan for the future because they don't know what Kirk Cousins' money is going to look like in a year or 2 years or 3 years, because all they've been doing is having to re-up him every year or two because they had to. That's the only way they've been.
I think this is something that no one really. This is something that no one really looked at when they looked at Cousins initially. I think we all were sticker shocked on him. But you're absolutely right. I mean, take a comparable quarterback. So, let's look at Derek Carr. When Derek Carr signed his deal, his deal was about 5 years. And, you're talking about in that sort of $22 million range, right? When you have 5 years to let the whole thing bleed out, by the last part of the deal, you are a value. And you have two options. Yeah. Either your quarterback rearranges money, right? So there are some years, so there are a bunch of different cap tricks that people use. One of them is you can take your if you know the guy's going to be on the roster, you can take their P5 salary and you can make it convert it into a signing bonus and split the cost over 5 years or less. And if you do that, then obviously you're piling years onto the back. This is what they're doing with some of the Vikings deals. And by the end of the deal, then the guy is sort of always making his money. But if you don't have to do that, and this is one of the things where we talk about Kansas City, the Chiefs didn't have to convert Patrick Mahomes' money this year because they were conscious about the cap. They ate it, and now that's perfect, right? And they moved Tyreek Hill. They ate the cap charge this year. People think about the Jimmy Garoppolo deal. The Jimmy Garoppolo deal was a huge deal, but he took almost all the money early, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so then when later on in the deal, he was actually a decent value because his cap charges weren't high. When and again, we're not blaming Kirk. Kirk is a first ballot Hall of Fame businessman in the NFL. This is a smart thing for the quarterback to do. But when you're on just 2-year deals, there is not that flexibility other than what Kwesi did with his deal now, which is they put a $12.5 million void year on the deal. So they did spread it out some, but you're paying $12.5 million not to play for you in 2024. But when you don't have a long-term quarterback, you can't spread out the cost.
To do that too. Right. And they need Kirk's permission to even do that. So, and Kirk had never agreed to that before, because we know that the Vikings had tried to do that with Kirk before. I think the only reason Kirk agreed to it now is because he knows that he's kind of toward the end of getting those fully guaranteed deals. And so this might be Kirk's last fully guaranteed deal, even if it's just a 1-year extension. So I think Kirk decided to take it and jump at it. And so we'll see how that goes beyond this year. But Kyle, you'd mentioned that like the Vikings should have filled the holes first before they signed Kirk. They did. Eric mentioned 2018. I know the what was it? The left guard, the right, one of the guards sucked, but overall that roster was elite. That roster was coming off an NFC Championship, and they had guys coming into in their primes, and Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Xavier Rhodes. Yeah, the reason they signed Kirk,
I mean, if that offense could support Case Keenum, it could support Kirk Cousins. What are we doing here?
Right.
Like that,
right.
You know,
so
it's just.
But like that's exactly the thing, right? So it's like you had it. So but now that they've had Kirk, it's been harder to revamp the roster around Kirk because his money has made it that much harder. So that's the
holes.
part.
The holes are that much more unpredictable as well. So again, I take this back to Kansas City. Kansas City had Eric Fisher and Mitchell Schwartz, two great tackles. They both sustained basically Chiefs-ending injuries in one season. So they got to do some things around the cap, but ultimately it leans on the quarterback. You just, like, when your quarterback is paid a lot of money, they have to cover up for holes on the team. And I think most Vikings fans would be realistic and say Kirk is a very good quarterback that has difficulty overcoming any roster level adversity. And the sticky wicket about this team is that his contract is one of the big reasons why they have roster level, adversity. And that doesn't make him a bad quarterback. That doesn't make him a bad guy. It just means when we're looking at the Vikings, my bull case on the Vikings is, look, if everything goes right, they could be pretty damn good. If anything goes wrong, all bets are off, as we've seen the last 2 years.
So Kyle, they tried to upgrade. Just one. My last thing, they tried to upgrade the O-line. They've drafted O-linemen in the first and second round. Like, you look at the entire Vikings O-line right now: first round pick, second round pick. 4 of the 5 starters are first or second round picks. So that the hard part there is when you have to rely on the draft to improve in an area. That's when your margin for error becomes razor thin. And of course, we know the Vikings didn't hit on all of those picks. And so that in itself becomes a really tough situation for your roster building.
But I bet you if they had $15 million guaranteed for per year for Joe Thuney, he would have worked out. That's the whole deal. Right. It's like the draft picks are all 50-50 propositions, and we've seen it play out. O'Neill's wonderful. Darashaw, I think, has all the ingredients to be great. Cleveland's like kind of, he's whatever. Wyatt Davis, not great. All this stuff. But you're batting 500 at all those positions. When you sign Joe Thuney, you're batting 800, right? It just costs more. And the Vikings have not been able to participate in those markets because of the situation they were in from the quarterback standpoint. And this is not Kwesi's fault. This is not Kirk's fault. But it was also Spielman continued to push contracts down the road, and then it became not only a Kirk problem, but a Kirk and Harrison Smith problem, a Kirk and Kyle Rudolph problem, a Kirk and Adam Thielen problem. Kyle, the Chiefs in 2020 went 14-2, and 60% of their offensive linemen were injured the whole season. Look at the rest of the league. Tom Brady's left tackle's Trent Brown.
Well, the teams you're talking about all made it to the Super Bowl. Like, the Vikings haven't sniffed the Super Bowl since 2017.
The big example he wants to use against this argument is the team lost the Super Bowl. I'm sorry, but this team the Vikings can't even make the playoffs. And you're saying that a bad offensive line cost a team a Super Bowl. They made it to the Super Bowl.
And they still could have. They almost won the game.
They should have. Yeah, I mean.
I think that's because they drafted Kirk or signed Kirk.
Yeah, why would you draft a quarterback in the first round? Like, look at the Packers drafted Jordan Love. They have to make a 5th-year option decision on Jordan Love, and he hasn't played. And if you draft a quarter, as we know with Kellen Mond, if you draft a quarterback after round 2, it's basically a long shot. So what are you even doing there?
I think that I've gotten everything I've wanted and more out of this conversation about Kirk Cousins. But I got to say, before I wrap this show, everything that you guys have laid out there in terms of quarterbacks and roster building and how having a rookie quarterback contract is so important to advancing in the playoffs makes me very scared as an NFC North team to kind of watch what the Lions are doing, because I think they are doing it right. They are filling all these holes on their team. They're fine riding it out with Jared Goff right now, but the second they draft that rookie quarterback that actually hits, I think we might be in a little bit of trouble here in Minnesota. With that being said, I do want to get one more thing from both of you, and then we can
Let
wrap
me
it.
let
So,
me
Dave,
answer Drell's question real quick. They were
okay,
yes,
keep them
they
out.
were always keeping the Vikings are always going to keep Kirk. I think I think Eric mentioned, Kwesi got the best out of the situation if they were going to have to keep Kirk by giving him a 1-year extension. I think that was the best case that they could do out of the situation. But I think yes, they were always going to keep Kirk. It sounds like.
We've talked about the Vikings this season overall. We've talked about whether or not Kirk can change the narrative. Can they win the NFC North? You both have said yes if circumstances are, kind of perfect. But I want to go back to one of the first comments we got tonight, and Eric even tweeted about it. But Eric, last preseason, you nailed the Vikings record. So I want to see if you can make it 2 for 2 here. Have you made an official record prediction on them? And if not, can you make it here tonight?
Yeah. I mean, the pandemic year, I said they would be 6-10. They finished 7-9, so they did overcome that 2020 year. I'm going to go with what the average simulation says. I think they're 9-8. I think that they're a little bit better than a coin flip to make the playoffs. The best bet on the board, if you're going to bet the Vikings, is Kevin O'Connell at 20-1 to win Coach of the Year on DraftKings. If you want to go there, I personally believe Jefferson and Cousins and Cook have always had great statistics. I think if this team is really good, they're not going to have better statistics than they've had before. So the not the blame, the credit is all going to go to Kevin O'Connell, and I think that is a good bet there.
So just one thing before I ask Myles how he thinks the Vikings are going to do. When you say Coach of the Year for Kevin O'Connell, Matt LaFleur didn't even win Coach of the Year in his rookie year, and he took Green Bay pretty far. Is that mean that, do you think Kevin O'Connell can really win Coach of the Year? I mean, he'd have to take this team presumably
Who beat
to the NFC
LaFleur?
Championship game.
Who beat LaFleur that year? Oh, Jesus. Oh, wow.
I do think it was
okay.
Nagy that year.
Somebody said that.
I think you might be right.
Somebody, by the way, commented and said it's not that I don't look at evidence; it's that I interpret evidence different than you. I guess you can live your truth, but they either make the playoffs or they don't, and so that's kind of my view on things. So the year that LaFleur took over the Packers, the Ravens went 14-2, and they got the MVP and the Coach of the Year in Harbaugh and Lamar. But most of the time, it's a team that's 11-5. So think about Vrabel. Stefanski was 11-5, and usually it's with a quarterback who's kind of a tier below the elite guys. So it's Mayfield, Tannehill, Cousins. The Vikings have all the ingredients to support a Coach of the Year, frankly, and so that's part of the thesis as well. Either if you're a great team, you either have an MVP candidate quarterback or a Coach of the Year, and I don't think they're going to have an MVP candidate quarterback.
Okay, Myles, if you had to have a record for the Vikings this year, a prediction, what would it be?
I'll go. Like I said earlier, like I said to start, 9-8, 10-7 are right in my range. I'm gonna say 10-7. I think they can win. I think they can win 10 games with the way the NFC is, with the way their schedule is. Obviously, people need to stay healthy, but when you have an elite player like Justin Jefferson, obviously we have a good quarterback in Kirk Cousins, and then you have, hopefully a really good offensive mind in Kevin O'Connell. I want to stay positive there because I do think he's going to be really good, but again, I think there'll be growing pains. So I'll say 10-7, and I think that they'll
By
be
the way, Kyle asked for the first time all time, he asked a reasonable question. He said, how do you expect O'Connell to win Coach of the Year at 9-8? My O'Connell winning Coach of the Year is a 20-1 bet, meaning I need it to happen I need it to happen in 5% of simulations, right? So if I expect the Vikings to be average 9-8, then the upper 5% of their distribution is 11-7, 12-5, 11-6, 12-5, something like that. So it's all about the price. I'm not betting even money for O'Connell to win Coach of the Year. I'm getting a 20-1 payout if he wins Coach of the Year. That's the point. I don't like them to win the Super Bowl, obviously, because I think that, for one, the Coach of the Year rarely wins the Super Bowl, but also it's just, I think if they win the division, Kevin O'Connell is going to win Coach of the Year, and I think they're going to win the division 25% of the time, and so it's much better than 20-1.
That's all I want to hear. 25% of the time, the Vikings are going to win the NFC North this year.
25% of the time.
Well, this was a fantastic show, and Myles, I'm super stoked that you're on Vikings Happy Hour moving forward here. Eric, we'll have to have you on more. I don't know if In the Huddle is going to be a thing this year. So if it's not, we'll make sure that you get enough FaceTime over here with me, Myles, Ryan, and Dave. But yeah, I'm excited. So thank you both so much. If you haven't yet, make sure to go over to our Climb in the Pocket YouTube channel, like and subscribe. I mentioned last week, but our goal this season is 4,000 subscribers. So let's boost those numbers. If you know somebody, mention our show, and let's get those numbers boosted up. For everybody that joined in the chat tonight, thank you very much. We appreciate it. It was flowing, and we could not ask for anything more than that. So I'll toss it over to Dave here, but we'll see you guys all next week.
I've got a betting question since I don't do it that often. The whole idea to make money in Vegas is you've got to win more than Vegas does. And Vegas always wins above 50% of the time, so they're guaranteed to make money. Am I correct?
Yeah, but I mean, if you're betting a long shot, you don't have to win more than 50%. You just have to win more than the price.
Okay. And we're being spammed again, of course. Now, if that's the case, when you got in the QB discussion, if QBA is better than QBB, and we look at this a lot, I look at it a lot when I do the preseason or the pregame shows. And generally, the better QB wins the game. Has anybody ran those numbers as to, looking back 10 years or however many years to see when QBA matched up against QBB and A is better than B, how many times A wins over B? It's obviously not going to be 100% of the time, but it
depends upon how you measure. 50%. Well, the biggest determination, if you want to take any one stat, is the passer rating difference between the quarterbacks. It's not enough to beat it's not enough to beat the spread, but if you know the passer rating differences between the quarterbacks, you can predict the outcome of the game fairly reliably. It's not obviously the most it's the most important variable. It's not the only important variable, but it is very important.
Good to know. Good to know. Also, while we have you here, you are I don't know if it's a new author, but at least an author again. Tell us about the book.
Yeah, my good friend Richard and I are writing a book, Football Analytics in Python and R. If you're interested in, we've released the first 6 chapters in sort of draft form on the O'Reilly website. If you are interested in football analytics and you want an introduction into coding and that kind of thing, that's for you. Hopefully, we'll probably be done with the book in the next calendar year or so, and then we'll release it in paperback. But I'm excited about that, and it's just it's just sort of added to my tab here of things to do over the next few months.
Well, that's awesome. Hope it is very successful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Does the New York Times have a category for
data science? No. I have not written my like football analytics tell all yet, but I think I've at least shown Myles some of the text messages of folks in the league that I get that will certainly go into that my tell all book about being an NFL analyst.
Oh, that should be fun to read. Well, that's great. Now, the rest of the week, the next Climbing the Pocket show is mine and Darren's with Two Old Bloggers on Saturday. It will be an hour or two earlier than normal this time, and we'll be talking about what happens in camp. Other than that, we had a great week so far. I think the test of the beta went well, with the one exception of remarks, but we'll get that hammered out. Any good word from camp that you've seen, Eric? What do you think of what's happened in Vikings training camp that you've seen that's raised your eyebrow?
For me, honestly, to me, it was the USA Today quote that Kwesi had, and maybe some of the quotes that came on after. He's certainly learning on the job there. So that's that one was interesting. Obviously, the Booth Jr., his emergence has been great. If he ends up being a starting caliber player for this team, that would be really, really huge in year one. But as I said, it would be the first time he's played over 1,000 snaps total in any season. So it's a little bit of a long shot, but I think I think it'd be a great get for the Vikings.
Sounds good. Matt, close her up.
That's all we have this week for Vikings Happy Hour. Dave mentioned his show on Saturday, so we'll if you don't catch that show, come back next Monday for the Real Forno show with Tyler and Dave. But other than that, Eric, again, appreciate your time this week, and like I said, we'll get you back here. So, SKOL Vikes.
SKOL Vikings. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell, and rate us on your favorite aggregator. And a special shout out goes to our partners, the Daily Norseman, where the best Vikings content can be found, and to Lake Monster Brewing, home of the best beer in Minnesota. SKOL, everybody.